an opinionated question for you. Feel free to share your opinion. It's completely open here. What are your thoughts on Confederate monuments and the flying of the Confederate flag?
Yeah, good questions. There's a lot written on this. This is actually one, I have a whole chapter in my dissertation that kind of focuses on these questions. I think there are multiple phases to the creation of Confederate monuments. There is the initial building phase that comes up a lot, sort of set in graveyards. That's where the monuments are initially created to honor the Confederate dead. That is primarily where they start. But over time, they start to become more and more prevalent in more and more central areas. And oftentimes, again, I can't really go into all the details because it is something in my dissertation, but they do serve a political purpose. They serve a purpose of sort of re-establishing the power of the Democratic Party in areas where it was a little bit more debated. There were areas of sort of during the 1880s, 1890s, where the Democrats are not doing so well in some places. So these monuments become kind of a extension of trying to become, to be able to sort of reassert power in a time period where they're afraid that they may be losing their edge. That does have a lot to do with it. There's an incident of one monument that I did a sort of a case study on, focusing on people were really, really upset about the fact that one state had a monument for a guy who died in the Spanish-American War, but didn't have a monument for a guy who died in the Civil War. So they spent like 3 years trying to raise the money to get this monument built, to sort of show he was a Southern martyr dying for the Confederacy. So I think that's really interesting because they become much more centralized. They become put in like central areas, courthouses, and that is to, in a way, saying we are continuing the legacy of these individuals. I think that's kind of the sort of the core of the issue with a lot of the monuments, but also the Confederate flag is another really interesting symbol here. And something that comes up a lot when I'm teaching quite often because there are, again, a lot of states say, yeah, it's about my heritage, you go, Southern heritage. And yeah, I would be able to sort of buy that argument to some extent, but the resurgence of the Confederate battle flag in particular occurs in the 1960s. And it occurs during the Civil Rights Movement. That's when, again, it had been used again, but it had always specifically meant the Confederacy. Yeah, the Confederacy fought for slavery, so yeah, it always kind of had that negative connotation to some way to some people, particularly African Americans, never really liked it. But when you look at the 1960s, you see people waving it explicitly to show their opposition to desegregation. That's where it becomes much more openly political. I mean, it's always been political. It is the representation of a government that fought for slavery, but they start waving it to show that we do not agree with what the federal government is doing regarding desegregating our schools. There are literally instances of schools that are being ordered to desegregate, and Virginia cuts off their charter. Like, that school closes because they would rather not let their people have a school than let the people have to go to an integrated school. So they start waving the Confederate flags to sort of show their opposition to this civil rights movement for African Americans. That's why you see it start being flown over courthouses. Again, it is literally incorporated into the Georgia state flag for a while to show opposition to the civil rights movement. And that's where it gets its much more modern negative political connotation. Again, a lot of people will look at it and say, yeah, this represents sort of Southern heritage, of course. But to a lot of other people, again, particularly African Americans, it represents people who literally use that as a symbol to show that you are not welcome. So it becomes a very, again, nuanced, complicated political debate over what it represents, what it means, and everybody's going to have different opinions on that. But I don't think the people who are sort of saying that this is a flag that sort of represents hate in a way, they're not entirely, they're not in the wrong necessarily, because in some ways that is what it came to be during the 1960s. And it's hard to sort of separate it from that legacy of the 60s and the legacy of the 1860s. It's hard to sort of separate that for a lot of people. Some people can do it no problem, but a lot of people are not willing to do that because it brings up very bad memories of sort of the idea of the Confederacy and particularly opposition to civil rights, I would say. So those are one of the reasons why they may remain so controversial in a lot of ways. It is kind of a really sort of an interesting, again, continuing point, and again in politics, because this stuff doesn't go away. Like, it continues and will continue to be a prevalent debate in politics for a while. And it is something that, again, there is more nuances to it, but it is, I can't really disagree with people who say, like, best represents what happened in the 1960s. I definitely understand their trepidation sort of around it, because in many ways it represents sort of people who inherently believe that you are inferior, particularly for African Americans. And I think more and more people are beginning to accept that idea as well. Of course, there are always people who don't see it as that, and that's, I guess, in that way it sort of makes sense to them. But it continues to sort of, as every day goes by, and more people start to see it as a symbol of sort of opposition, to resist the thing. Particularly because the 1960s, it was also the idea not just desegregation, but the fact that the federal government was arguing and pushing for desegregation, and they're saying that the federal government doesn't have the right to do that, so that's why the Confederate symbol comes up again. They start using it again, their knowledge of history, to make those connections, to say, hey, this is the exact same thing that the Confederates fought for. They're fighting for their rights to not let a federal government come in and tell them what to do. But again, it still comes down to federal government telling them not to have slavery, federal government telling them to not have segregation. It continues to recur in these same instances. There's a lot of times where the federal government comes in, tells them to do things like, that they don't necessarily agree with, but the Confederate flag doesn't really come up then. It's only when it comes around these issues of race that they continue to bring that as a political symbol, I think, when it comes to sort of the idea that the federal government is coming in and pushing us on us something that we don't like, particularly when it comes to sort of upsetting the racial hierarchy. That's when the flags start to come out, and one of the reasons why it has its more negative connotation today.
Yeah, it's such a complicated, nuanced issue, almost more so than the issue of secession itself. But it seems that it was sort of a reactionary force of opposition to the civil rights movement, like you mentioned, the resurgence of it, at least. And we can clearly condemn any sort of instance where the Confederate flag is used in a position of hate or to push a political rhetoric that's rooted in racism or anything like that. Clearly condemnable, not justifiable in any way. But I think if you ask the majority of Americans what they think when they see a Confederate flag, they instantly say hate, racism, slavery, things like that. But there is a side to this that comes from a position of, Southern honor and Southern heritage and Southern remembrance, because like we mentioned, not everyone who fought in the Confederacy was, adamantly racist and pro-slavery and had slaves. There are a large aspect of this that's just rooted in remembering heritage. My ancestors fought in the Confederacy. I'm proud of my heritage. They didn't own slaves or anything like that. But is it possible to separate the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments from slavery and racism to just remember and honor heritage? Or are they inseparable in that sense? Because obviously they're used for hate a lot of times, and I want to condemn that very clearly. But I think there are instances where you can use the Confederate flag as a symbol of your heritage when there's no ill will meant towards anyone.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that's something that is up more to sort of, it's much more like a personal choice, I guess, personal approach there, sort of an individualistic one, because I don't think it's possible really to do it on a grand scale anymore. I think as more people become aware sort of the legacy of the Confederacy, it becomes harder for people to make that separation. And I think that is, again, people can obviously use it for heritage and say that is their heritage, but they also kind of have to deal with the way that may look to other people who don't see it that way. And, I mean, if they're willing, I guess, to make that concession, that's, I guess, sort of up to them, but it is, again, so much more complicated. So because again, I have Southern heritage. I love the South. I literally live in the South. Wonderful people, great food. So I understand that for sure. But the the symbology of it is something that's just sort of hard to get behind on for me personally. And I think the again, sort of like you said, the majority of people will see it in that way. So it's all up to the individual person if they're willing to sort of grapple with that. And of course, that can't be made up by anybody else. That is a sort of an individual choice that people have to decide. But again, I do see sort of the complexity of it, and it is very nuanced. But sort of for me personally, I can't really sort of make that separation because I am a Confederate historian. Like I study the Confederacy, it's hard for me to see it as anything other than a symbol of the Confederacy. But for people who are not as invested in the history of it, I can see why they would not see it that way, but I think they should be open more towards the conversations that will prompt. Because they can't sort of, it will oftentimes lead to sort of a feeling of vitriol, but I think there are some nuanced conversations to be had if people are willing to have that conversation. But I think there's really no way to sort of, at least to me anyway, to kind of continue to make that separation myself.
Yeah, being open to conversation, I think, is very important, and that's something we lack very much so in today's society. Is people aren't really open to conversation, very much so rooted in their beliefs and their biases, and it's completely understandable that it's seen as a symbol of slavery and racism and hatred by African Americans. That's completely understandable and justified, but it's unfortunate that proponents of the lost cause and people of Confederate descent use it as a symbol of hate because it's just further tarnishing the symbol and the legacy and further cementing this rhetoric of hate. And it's unfortunate because you're just painting a bad picture for yourself. You're not helping the situation in any way.
Right. And it create in some ways does paint a sort of negative perception of the South, which again, South is great. I love the South. I love the people of the South. And I'm always one of the first people out there who are trying to defend sort of southern people, sort of southern culture. Obviously not the racial parts, but sort of the southern culture. Because again, there are a lot of African Americans in the South. I love African Americans in the South as well. Like they are included in that, and I think it is such a beautiful region. Great literary tradition, great cultural tradition, food. I love all of that, and I think that sort of this continued focus on sort of Confederate ideology, Confederate symbology, things like that, does continue to paint a negative picture to people who are not in the South. Because often people, even today, will say it's like, oh, that's a backward region, it's all this stuff. And I mean, living in the South, I don't see that. But that is the way that it looks to people who are not here, simply because of that complicated history that I think. Because again, people don't think about the segregation, the housing segregation that happened in the North. That happened there too. But it's not spoken about because it's not as open. In some ways, because it's not as open, it's also very insidious in some ways. But it is, again, like I said, it's so much more nuanced than that. And I think that by sort of focusing on the history of the South solely in those terms, it really, again, makes it a black and white region. And that's not the case. It is a nuanced place. Again, yeah, there are issues in the South, there are issues in the North, there are issues everywhere. But I think that there's a lot more to it that are often overlooked when it comes down to the discussions of, obviously, sort of race, class, things like that, which, again, those are all very important and they should be studied. I study them myself. I find them compelling. But there is more to it than that. And it's very hard to sort of fight against sort of, again, historical narratives. It's always one of those things that I'm trying to sort of fight against the lost cause, fight against negative perceptions of places. That's one of the things, sort of fighting against stereotypes. That's something that I always want to do with my work. Sort of this anti-racist, I guess, anti-stereotype, kind of showing the nuances of people. Because again, people are not one thing. They are multifaceted. It's so easy to look at George Washington, oh yeah, George Washington, beloved dude. When he ran as president, his approval rating was really bad for his second term. It's like you don't think about that. Like the idea, there's a book I read about sort of this idea of the big man of history idea. That, we talk about these great people in history, and in talking about their greatness, we strip away the stuff that makes them interesting. Again, the fact, Jefferson, interesting guy. really complicated views on slavery. And you can't really separate the two because that is what makes him interesting. Focusing solely on the good presents a very boring depiction of people. Focusing solely on the bad creates a very boring depiction of people. It is nuanced. They are three-dimensional people. And I think that is something that, me as a historian myself, that's something that I fully believe in. Trying to, again, push narratives and sort of undertaking the deconstruction of some of these complicated, harmful narratives in some ways, and showing that, history is made of people. It's not set in stone. It's not monolithic. That the choices that an individual make can shape history. That's one of the things I always bring up to my students in class, that students, they have knowledge, they have the ability, they can go out there and change the world. Sometimes may not seem like it, but people have the capacity to do wonderful things. But they have to sort of be aware of where we come from. I always say that, in my classes, that history is something that is still happening. That if you look at the world we are in today, it is book 7 in an ongoing series. And you can't just sit down and read book 7 and have any understanding of what's going on. That you have to truly understand America, to truly understand the world today, even especially this year, it's an election year. It's important to understand how we got to where we are. My job as a professor, as a lecturer, is to get them caught up. So that way, when they do go out and vote, when they do go out to change the world, they do so with a more nuanced understanding of how we got here. Because, again, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And I think the best way to be able to sort of be aware of those issues is to be an informed person. It's one of the reasons, it's one of the things I always focus on, try to make those comparisons to today, because this is not something that just happened in the past. We're constantly coming up with new ways of thinking about things. Yeah, the information may not change, but we develop new cultural ways and new understandings of the past. And looking at the past is important, sort of understanding the nuances, looking at it through gender, race, class, identity. Those are all things that are really sort of cutting edge right now. How people perceive of themselves in history, and being able to make those comparisons to help get people caught up to the present moment, I think is one of the main things that I do. That's what drives me. That's one of my sort of the passions, is to give them the ability to go out and make a positive change in the world. Because the world always needs positive attitudes, positive change. And I think that the best way to do that is by becoming informed. Becoming somebody who is aware of what's come before, so that you do not make the same mistakes that people in the past have made. And maybe learn to see what works, what doesn't work, and make the world a better place. Because you can't sort of separate the present moment from what's come before.
Wow. That's so beautifully said. I mean, you need to clip that speech and make that, your life's motto, because that was beautifully said. I actually had a guest on a couple of weeks ago. It was probably one of my favorite podcast episodes I did, Jason Voyevich, about the Consumer Revolution in the 1920s. And he said the same thing. He said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And it's so true. I mean, it's a beautiful saying. And I like to say, study the past so you can understand the present and conceptualize the future. It's so important to study the past, know where we come from, know the truth of it, look through the fogginess of it all. But I love the South. I'm from the South. I'm from Florida. I know a lot of people don't consider that the South. I do. Southern hospitality. There's a beautiful Southern culture. We all have our dark aspects of history, but it's a beautiful culture down here. And you're right, though. It is individualistic. Everyone's going to have their individual symbols and views, but especially when it comes to the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments, it's very difficult, dare I say impossible, to separate on a grand scale, the dark history of it from anyone using it for Southern heritage or anything like that.